If you are fascinated by the hidden histories of the Cold War and the ordinary people who changed the course of history, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. It helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. To understand how the most significant espionage ring in New York City was dismantled, you first have to understand the unique invisibility of a 12-year-old boy in 1953. In the boroughs of Brooklyn, specifically the Flatbush neighborhood, the world was a grid of brick row houses, corner candy stores, and the distant rhythmic rumble of the subway. It was a world of routine. Men in gray flannel suits left for Manhattan at 7 a.m. Women in floral aprons swept the stoops at 8 a.m. And in the hours before the city fully woke up, the Paperboys owned the streets. Tommy Miller was one of these boys. At 12 years old, he was small for his age, with scuffed knees and a canvas bag that, when fully loaded with the morning edition of the New York Herald-Tribune, weighed nearly as much as he did. To the adults on his route, Tommy was less of a person and more of a function. He was the mechanism by which the news arrived. He was the soft thud of paper hitting the doormat. He was the blur of motion on a Schwinn bicycle. Because he was a child, and because he was a servant of their morning routine, the adults rarely guarded their words around him. They argued in open doorways, they left their blinds up, and they exchanged hushed conversations on street corners, assuming that a boy concerned with baseball stats and comic books was not listening. But Tommy Miller was always listening. On the morning of June 14, 1953, the humidity in Brooklyn was already stifling, a heavy blanket of air that smelled of asphalt and exhaust. Tommy's route took him down Foster Avenue, a long stretch of residential buildings interspersed with small businesses. His routine was precise. He knew which houses had dogs, which customers tipped at Christmas, and which steps were treacherous when it rained. He moved with the efficiency of a soldier, a trait he had picked up from his father, a Korean War veteran who emphasized the importance of discipline. Tommy's world was defined by the tangible, the ink that stained his fingertips black, the copper taste of pennies in his mouth when he held them between his lips to make change, and the weight of the coins in his pocket. In 1953, a nickel could buy a candy bar, a pack of gum, or a ride on the bus. It was a unit of freedom. Tommy collected them with a fervor bordering on obsession, saving for a new catcher's mitt in the window of Kleiner's Sporting Goods. That morning, the city felt tense. The newspapers in his bag carried headlines about the Rosenbergs, about the Red Scare, about the bomb. The adults seemed to walk faster, their faces tighter. But for Tommy, the primary concern was the collection. It was Friday, collection day, the day he had to knock on doors and ask for the weekly subscription fee. It was the part of the job he hated most, forcing him to intrude on the private lives of his customers, to stand there and wait while they fished through purses and pockets. He didn't know it yet, but the collection he was about to make would not just buy him a baseball mitt. It would purchase a ticket into a world of shadows, codes, and high-stakes betrayal that most people only read about in the very papers he delivered. The Cold War was not fighting on a battlefield in Europe. It was waiting for him behind the door of apartment 4B. The tenant in 4B was a man named Mr. Arthur Hemlock. In the theater of the neighborhood where everyone played a role, the gossip, the drunk, the strict matriarch, Hemlock was an extra. He was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 40, perhaps 50. He wore unremarkable clothing, usually brown or gray slacks and a white shirt that was clean but never crisp. He worked, or so the neighborhood rumors went, as a bookkeeper for a logistics firm in the Navy Yard, a job that explained his quiet demeanor and his punctuality. Tommy had been delivering to Mr. Hemlock for 6 months. The interactions were script-like in their brevity. Tommy would knock. Hemlock would open the door exactly 3 inches, the safety chain still engaged. He would slide the money through the gap, take the paper, and close the door. There were no pleasantries about the weather, no inquiries about school. Hemlock was a ghost who paid his bills. On this particular Friday, however, the routine fractured. When Tommy knocked, the door didn't open immediately. He heard movement inside, the sound of a radio being abruptly turned down, and the shuffling of papers. It took nearly a minute for Hemlock to appear. When he did, he looked flushed, a sheen of sweat on his high forehead. He was not wearing his usual white shirt. Instead, he was in an undershirt, and his hands were trembling slightly. "Collection?" Hemlock asked, his voice raspier than usual. Yes, sir, 35 cents for the week, Tommy said, shifting the weight of the bag on his shoulder. Hemlock nodded, distracted. He turned away from the door, leaving it open a crack, a violation of his own security protocol that Tommy noted immediately. Through the gap, Tommy could see into the apartment. It was sparse, almost clinical. There were no family photos on the walls, no clutter. But on the dining table, Tommy saw a stack of maps and a camera with a long, intricate lens, the kind Tommy had seen in photography magazines. Hemlock returned a moment later, digging his hand into his pocket. He pulled out a handful of change and began counting it into Tommy's open palm. 10, 20, 30, Hemlock muttered. He paused. He was short. He dug into his other pocket, the movement jerky and impatient. He pulled out another coin and dropped it onto the pile. Keep the change. The door slammed shut, the deadbolt sliding home with a heavy metallic click. Tommy stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the money. It was 35 cents exactly, plus a nickel tip. He shrugged, dropped the coins into his heavy canvas apron, and moved to the next apartment. It was just another transaction, just another nickel. But as he walked down the stairs and back out into the humid Brooklyn morning, something nagged at him. Tommy Miller handled hundreds of coins a week. He knew the feel of them, the density, the way they clinked against each other. And the nickel Mr. Hemlock had given him, the one now resting at the bottom of his pocket, had felt wrong. It was a sensation he couldn't quite articulate, a subtle difference in weight, a hollowness to the sound it made when it hit the other coins. He reached into his pocket and fished it out. It was a Jefferson nickel, dated 1948. It looked like every other nickel in existence, Monticello on the back, Jefferson on the front. But when he flipped it in the air, it didn't ring with that solid, satisfying chime. It landed with a dull thud in his palm. Tommy frowned, rubbing the coin between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't know that he was holding a device engineered by the KGB's technical directorate in Moscow. He didn't know that this tiny object was designed to bring down the American defense grid. He just knew that Mr. Hemlock, the ghost of Foster Avenue, had given him a fake nickel, and Tommy Miller hated being cheated. The discovery happened 3 blocks away, outside the pharmacy where Tommy usually stopped to buy a soda. He was sitting on the curb, sorting his collection money, separating the quarters from the dimes. He picked up the strange nickel again. The morning sun was brighter now, and under the direct light, he noticed a faint line running around the rim of the coin, bisecting the edge. Curiosity warred with irritation. Was it a magician's coin, a manufacturing error? He squeezed it, but it didn't yield. He bit it, testing the metal, but it tasted like old copper and nickel. Frustrated, he threw it against the concrete sidewalk. The sound was not a clatter. It was a pop. The nickel split in half. Tommy froze. The 2 faces of the coin had separated, revealing that the interior had been hollowed out with the precision of a watchmaker. One half of the coin was a cover. The other half contained a tiny drilled-out compartment. And inside that compartment, resting like a pearl in an oyster, was a square of film no larger than a pinky fingernail. The world around him, the traffic on the avenue, the shouting of the pharmacy owner, seemed to fade away. Tommy stared at the microfilm. Even at 12, he knew what this was. He read the Hardy Boys. He listened to The Shadow. He knew that normal people didn't hollow out nickels to hide pictures of their grandmother. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He looked around quickly, suddenly paranoid. Had anyone seen him drop it? Was someone watching? He remembered Hemlock's face, the sweat, the maps on the table, the camera. The pieces clicked together with terrifying speed. Mr. Hemlock wasn't a bookkeeper. Trembling, Tommy picked up the 2 halves of the coin and the tiny square of film. He tried to snap the coin back together, but his hands were shaking too badly. He wrapped the pieces in a clean handkerchief from his back pocket and shoved the bundle deep into his bag beneath the unsold papers. He didn't buy his soda. He got back on his bicycle and pedaled. He didn't go home, and he didn't go to the newspaper distribution center. He rode toward the 70th Precinct station house. But as he rode, doubt began to creep in. Who would believe him? He was a kid. Adults didn't listen to kids about broken windows, let alone spies. If he walked into the police station with a broken nickel, they might laugh at him. They might take it and tell him to run along and then nothing would happen. Or worse, maybe the police were in on it. In the comic books, you could never be sure who to trust. He stopped his bike 2 blocks from the station. He needed a plan. He needed someone who would take him seriously. He thought of his father, but his father was at work at the auto plant and wouldn't be home until 6. He couldn't wait that long. The nickel felt radioactive in his bag. He remembered a customer on the far end of his route, Mr. Sullivan. He was a stern man who lived in a brownstone on Ocean Parkway. Tommy had seen him once in a suit that looked too expensive for the neighborhood, getting into a black sedan with government plates. The neighborhood kids whispered that he was a G-man, an agent of the FBI. It was mostly playground legend, based on the fact that he never smiled and always checked his mailbox with a wary look. It was a gamble. If the rumors were wrong, Mr. Sullivan might just be an angry accountant. But if they were right... Tommy turned his bike around. He pedaled hard, his legs burning, the heavy canvas bag thumping against his back. He was no longer just a paperboy. He was a courier carrying a secret that could burn the city down. Frank Sullivan was not, in fact, an accountant. He was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, currently assigned to the Counterintelligence Division of the New York Field Office. He was 42 years old, tired, and cynical. He had spent the last 5 years chasing ghosts, tips that went nowhere, names that didn't exist, and communist plots reported by neighbors who simply held grudges over property lines. It was his day off. He was sitting in his living room, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the very paper Tommy Miller had delivered 2 hours earlier. When the doorbell rang, Sullivan didn't move immediately. He wasn't expecting anyone. He let it ring a second time before sighing, standing up and walking to the door. He opened it to find the paperboy standing there, red-faced and gasping for breath, clutching his canvas bag as if it contained the crown jewels. "Paper's already here, kid," Sullivan said, his voice gruff. "I paid you on Tuesday." "It's not about the paper, Mr. Sullivan," Tommy wheezed. He looked left and right, scanning the street with a seriousness that Sullivan found both amusing and slightly unsettling. Are you really with the FBI?" Sullivan's eyes narrowed. He leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. "Who told you that?" "Danny Russo. He said he saw your badge once when you were getting your keys out." Sullivan made a mental note to be more careful. "Danny Russo has an active imagination. What do you want, son?" Tommy didn't speak. He reached into his bag, unwrapped the handkerchief, and held it out. In the center of the white cloth lay the 2 halves of the nickel and the tiny dark square of film. Sullivan's demeanor changed instantly. The tired bureaucrat vanished. The hunter appeared. He didn't touch the objects. He looked at them. Then he looked at the street, scanning for parked cars, for loiterers, for anything out of place. He reached out, grabbed Tommy by the shoulder, perhaps a little too firmly, and pulled him inside. "Lock the door," Sullivan commanded. They sat at the kitchen table. Sullivan used a pair of tweezers from a utility drawer to examine the film. He held it up to the light coming through the window. It was a microdot. He had seen them in training, heard about them in briefings, but he had never actually seen one in the wild. This was high-level tradecraft. This was the real deal. "Where did you get this?" Sullivan asked, his voice low and intense. "Mr. Hemlock," Tommy said. "Apartment 4B, over on Foster. He gave it to me for the paper. He made a mistake. He was rushing." "Hemlock," Sullivan repeated, testing the name. He didn't write it down. He memorized it. "Tell me everything. How did he look? What was he wearing? What did you see in the apartment?" Tommy recounted the morning in vivid detail, the sweat, the undershirt, the maps, the camera. Sullivan listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the boy's face, evaluating his credibility. The boy was observant. He noticed the chain on the door, the type of camera lens. He wasn't making this up. "You haven't told anyone else?" Sullivan asked. "No, sir, just you." Sullivan sat back, exhaling a long breath. He looked at the nickel on the table. It was a mistake, a 1 in a million slip-up. The Soviets relied on technology and procedure, but they were still human. They got tired. They got careless. And this man, Hemlock, had just handed his death warrant to a 12-year-old boy. Listen to me very carefully, Tommy, Sullivan said. You are going to go home. You are going to eat your lunch. You are not going to tell your mother, your father, or Danny Russo about this. As far as you're concerned, you lost a nickel today. Do you understand? Is he a spy? Tommy asked, his eyes wide. He's something, Sullivan said grimly, and now he's my problem. You did good, kid. You did real good, but now you need to be invisible again. By 2 p.m., the machinery of the U.S. government was turning. Sullivan had driven Tommy's evidence to the FBI field office in Manhattan. The microfilm was in the cryptography lab. The nickel was being dusted for prints, though they expected none. The agent would have been careful up until the moment he wasn't. The image on the microfilm was a sequence of numbers, columns and rows of 5-digit groups. It was a cipher. Without the key, usually a one-time pad, it was unbreakable. But the content of the message mattered less right now than the existence of the messenger. Sullivan stood in the office of Assistant Director Charles Higgins. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Hemlock is an alias, Higgins said, tossing a file onto his desk. We checked the utility records. The apartment is leased to an Arthur Hemlock, claims to be a clerk. No credit history, no selective service number, Social Security card issued 3 years ago in Ohio. The man didn't exist before 1950. He's a sleeper, Sullivan said. Deep cover. He's been waiting. Or working, Higgins corrected. The boy said he saw maps. If he's photographing defense installations or logistics routes from the Navy Yard, he could be coordinating sabotage or just feeding target data. We need to bring him in, a junior agent suggested from the corner. No, Sullivan and Higgins said in unison. If we grab him now, Sullivan explained, we get one man. We get a camera and some maps. We don't know who he reports to. We don't know who his courier is. That nickel wasn't meant for a paperboy. It was meant for a drop. He's part of a network. Higgins nodded. We watch him. We wire the building. We track every step he takes. If he sneezes, I want to know what color the handkerchief is. And Sullivan? Sir? The boy. Is he safe? He's a smart kid, Sullivan said, but he's still a kid. He goes back to that apartment every morning. If Hemlock realizes he gave away the nickel, the unspoken threat hung in the room. If the spy realized his mistake, the first thing he would do is retrace his steps. He would remember the flustered transaction at the door. He would remember the paperboy. Put a detail on the kid, Higgins ordered. Distance surveillance. I don't want the neighbors getting suspicious, but if Hemlock goes anywhere near that boy, you take him down. Cover or no cover. The surveillance of Arthur Hemlock began that evening. It was a masterpiece of urban camouflage. The FBI commandeered an apartment across the street, evicting a bewildered bachelor with a story about a gas leak. They set up cameras with telephoto lenses behind sheer curtains. They brought in a van disguised as a plumber's repair vehicle, parked down the block to monitor radio frequencies. Tommy Miller went to sleep that night clutching his baseball bat, staring at the ceiling. He felt a strange mixture of terror and pride. He was part of the secret world now. He imagined Mr. Sullivan out there in the dark, watching. The next morning, the routine resumed. Tommy woke up at 5 a.m. He picked up his papers. He rode his bike. But the streets felt different. The shadows seemed deeper. As he approached Foster Avenue, his heart rate spiked. He had to deliver the paper to 4B. If he didn't, Hemlock would know something was wrong. Routine was the camouflage. He walked up the stairs, his legs feeling like lead. He approached the door. He could hear the faint sound of the radio again. He took a breath, folded the paper, and knocked. The door did not open. "Leave it," a voice called from inside. It was Hemlock. He sounded calm. Tommy dropped the paper on the mat. "Have a good day, Mr. Hemlock," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "You too, son," the voice replied. Tommy walked away, forcing himself not to run. Across the street in the darkened apartment, Sullivan watched through a pair of binoculars. "He's cool," Sullivan whispered to the agent beside him. "The kid is holding it together." Inside apartment 4B, Arthur Hemlock stood by the door, listening to the boy's footsteps fade away. He was not calm. He was terrified. He had spent the last 24 hours tearing his apartment apart. He had checked his pockets 1,000 times. He knew he had the hollow nickel when he answered the door. He knew it was gone when he sat back down. He had retraced every moment. The only time the nickel could have left his possession was during the payment. He had given it to the boy. Hemlock, whose real name was Victor, paced the small living room. He was a trained agent of the GRU. He knew the protocols. If compromised, abandon the site. Signal for extraction. Disappear. But he hesitated. It was just a nickel. The boy was a child. A dull American child obsessed with candy and toys. He had likely spent the nickel within an hour. The coin would be in a cash register at a soda fountain, mixed with thousands of others, its secret payload traveling anonymously through the economy. The chances of it being discovered were infinitesimal. If he ran now, he would be admitting failure. He would be recalled to Moscow, and failure in the GRU was not met with a pension plan. It was met with a basement room in Lubyanka prison. Victor decided to wait. He would watch the boy. He would see if the boy acted differently. If the police didn't kick down his door in the next 24 hours, he was safe. He convinced himself that luck was on his side. It was the fatal optimism of a desperate man. For 3 weeks, the dance continued. The FBI watched Hemlock. Hemlock watched the street, and Tommy Miller delivered the papers. The surveillance team began to build a profile. Hemlock left the apartment every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. He took the subway to Manhattan. He went to the public library on 42nd Street. He sat in the reading room, always at the same table. Sullivan followed him on foot, blending into the midtown crowds. He watched as Hemlock picked up books on naval engineering and maritime history, but Hemlock wasn't reading. He was waiting. On the third Thursday, contact was made. A woman in a red coat carrying a shopping bag from Macy's sat at the table opposite Hemlock. They didn't speak. She read a magazine. He read a book. After 20 minutes, Hemlock stood up to leave. He left his book on the table. The woman waited 5 minutes, then picked up the book and returned it to the shelf. Sullivan signaled his team. "Tail the woman. I'm staying with Hemlock." They had found the cutout. The network was revealing itself. The book, retrieved later by an agent posing as a librarian, contained a message written in invisible ink on page 142. It was a request for updated schematics of the Brooklyn Navy Yard's new dry dock repairs. The investigation was expanding. The woman led them to an attaché at the Hungarian consulate. The attaché led them to a safe house in Queens. It was a sprawling web of espionage, all unraveling because a 12-year-old boy knew what a nickel should weigh. But the pressure on Tommy was growing. Hemlock had started waiting by the door again. He would open it when Tommy knocked, staring at the boy with an intensity that made Tommy's skin crawl. "You look tired, Tommy," Hemlock said one morning, leaning against the doorframe. "Working too hard?" "Just school, Mr. Hemlock," Tommy managed to say. "Lots of homework." "You're a smart boy," Hemlock said softly. "Observant. You notice things, don't you?" "I guess so." "Did you find anything interesting lately? On your route?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Tommy gripped the strap of his bag. He knew this was a test. If he flinched, if he looked away, Hemlock would know. "Just bottle caps," Tommy said, channeling a boredom he didn't feel. "And a dead pigeon on 12th Avenue. Hemlock stared at him for a long second, his eyes searching for deceit. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a cold, lifeless smile. "Run along then, Tommy." The FBI realized that the window was closing. The psychological pressure on the boy was becoming dangerous, and Hemlock was getting restless. The intercepts from the safe house in Queens indicated that a major operation was imminent. The Soviets were planning to steal the guidance system plans for a new experimental torpedo being developed at the Navy Yard. Sullivan met with Higgins. "We have to move. Hemlock is the linchpin. If we take him, we can roll up the rest of the network before they get the torpedo plans." "We need the evidence," Higgins said. "We have the nickel, but we need to catch him in the act of espionage. We need to catch him passing the documents." They decided to bait the trap. The Navy, working with the FBI, created a set of classified documents, genuine-looking blueprints that were actually flawed designs. They leaked information through a known double agent that a courier would be carrying these plans through Penn Station on Friday evening. They knew Hemlock would be the one to verify the handover, or perhaps perform the intercept himself. But Hemlock was cautious. He didn't go to Penn Station. Instead, on Friday morning, he handed Tommy a tip. "Here," Hemlock said, pressing a quarter into Tommy's hand. "Buy yourself something nice." "And Tommy?" "Yes, sir? I won't be needing the paper next week. I'm going on a trip." Tommy froze. "A trip?" "A long trip," Hemlock said. "I'm leaving tonight." Tommy rode his bike directly to the corner where he knew Sullivan's car was parked. He tapped on the window. Sullivan rolled it down. "He's running," Tommy whispered. "He said he's leaving tonight. A long trip." Sullivan cursed. The trap at Penn Station was a bust. Hemlock wasn't going for the bait. He was bugging out. He must have sensed the surveillance, or perhaps the leak had been too obvious. "Go home, Tommy," Sullivan said, starting the engine. "Stay inside." The order went out. Arrest on sight. Agents converged on Foster Avenue. But Hemlock was already moving. He left the apartment building through the basement exit, carrying a single suitcase. He was dressed not in his gray clerk's clothes, but in a darker suit, wearing a hat pulled low. He moved toward the subway station, walking briskly. He didn't look back. He was a professional, and he knew that looking back was a tell. Sullivan and 2 other agents followed on foot, keeping a half-block distance. They couldn't take him on the street. Too many civilians, too much risk of a stray bullet if Hemlock was armed. They needed to corner him. Hemlock entered the Church Avenue station. He swiped through the turnstile and moved to the far end of the platform. The train was coming. The tunnel rumbled with its approach. Sullivan moved down the stairs. He signaled his men to flank the exits. As the train screeched into the station, Hemlock didn't board. He waited for the doors to open, stepped in, and then, just as they were closing, stepped back out. It was a classic anti-surveillance move. Sullivan, who had boarded the next car, was forced to pry the doors open with his shoulder and scramble back onto the platform. Hemlock saw him. The eyes of the 2 men locked across the crowded platform. The pretense was over. Hemlock turned and ran. He didn't run toward the exit. He ran toward the tunnel at the end of the platform, jumping down onto the tracks and disappearing into the darkness. "Cut the power!" Sullivan screamed to the station attendant in the booth. "Cut the 3rd rail!" Sullivan vaulted onto the tracks, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth. He could hear Hemlock's footsteps splashing through the drainage water ahead. Chapter 10. The Tunnel. The chase through the subway tunnel was a nightmare of shadows. Rats scurried away from the light. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the 2 men. Hemlock was heading toward the ventilation shaft that led up to a service grate on the street level. He was fast, fueled by adrenaline. But Sullivan was fueled by 5 years of frustration. They reached a service alcove. Hemlock spun around, a small pistol in his hand. "FBI, drop it!" Sullivan shouted, his voice echoing off the curved walls. Hemlock didn't fire. He hesitated. He knew that if he fired, he would be a cop killer, and the hunt would never stop. If he surrendered, there was a chance for a trade. Spy swaps happened. "It's over, Victor," Sullivan said, using the agent's real name. "We have the nickel. We have the film. We have the woman in the red coat. It's done." Hemlock's shoulders slumped. The gun lowered. "The boy," Hemlock said, his voice echoing in the tunnel. "It was the boy, wasn't it?" "It was a bad nickel," Sullivan said. "Bad luck." Hemlock laughed, a dry, bitter sound. He dropped the gun. It splashed into the oily water between the ties. "A nickel," he muttered. The revolution defeated by loose change. Chapter 11. The Cleanup. The arrest of Arthur Hemlock was not reported in the evening papers. The Herald Tribune carried stories about the Yankees and the weather. The neighbors on Foster Avenue were told that Mr. Hemlock had been transferred by his company to a branch in Ohio. The landlady complained about him breaking the lease, but she was happy to rent the unit to a nice young couple the following week. In the FBI field office, the dismantling of the ring was methodical and quiet. Based on the intelligence found in Hemlock's apartment, concealed in hollowed-out furniture and false-bottom soup cans, the Bureau rolled up 12 other agents across the Northeast. The threat to the Navy Yard was neutralized. The torpedo plans remained secure. Frank Sullivan sat in his office typing the final report. He stared at the section labeled Informant. He typed, "Confidential Source 482." He would not write Tommy's name. He would not put a target on the kid's back. A week later, Sullivan drove back to Flatbush. He parked on the corner and waited for the morning delivery. Tommy came riding down the street, his bag lighter near the end of the route. He saw the black sedan and slowed down. Sullivan got out. He didn't smile. He wasn't the smiling type, but his face was softer than usual. "He's gone," Sullivan said. "For good." Tommy nodded, looking at his handlebars. Is he dead?" "No," Sullivan said. "He's going to prison for a very long time." "You're safe, Tommy. The neighborhood is safe." Sullivan reached into his pocket. He pulled out a brand new catcher's mitt. It was the one from Kleiner's Sporting Goods, legitimate leather, smelling of oil and promise. "The Bureau has a budget for expenses," Sullivan lied. "We figured you earned a commission." Tommy took the mitt. He put his small hand inside it. It fit perfectly. "Thanks, Mr. Sullivan." "Keep your eyes open, kid," Sullivan said, getting back into the car. "You never know what you'll find." Chapter 12. The Legacy of Small Things. Tommy Miller grew up. The Cold War dragged on, moving from the paranoia of the 50s to the brinksmanship of the 60s and the malaise of the 70s. Tommy went to college, got drafted, went to Vietnam, and came back. He became a structural engineer, building the skyscrapers that would define the New York skyline. He never told anyone the full story. It was a memory that felt like a dream, the hollow nickel, the chase, the man in the tunnel. But he kept the mitt. It sat on a shelf in his garage, cracked and worn, a relic of a time when the war was fought on his doorstep. Decades later, in 1992, after the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet Union had collapsed, the FBI declassified a trove of documents from the hollow coin case. A journalist found the files. She tracked down the details of the spy ring that had been dismantled in 1953. She found Thomas Miller, now a grandfather living in New Jersey. She sat at his kitchen table, recording his voice. "It seems impossible," the journalist said, "that a massive intelligence operation was brought down because a spy didn't have the right change." Thomas smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a nickel. He placed it on the table. "It wasn't about the change," Thomas said. "It was about the mistake. They thought they were invisible. They thought we were just scenery, the paperboys, the clerks, the people on the subway. They forgot that we were watching too." He spun the nickel on the table. It hummed, a blur of silver. "The world is built on small things," Thomas said. "You miss the small things, you lose the big things." The nickel stopped spinning and settled on the table. It was solid. It was real. And in the silence of the kitchen, it rang like a bell.